Welcome back to another episode of Dojo Live. I am Tulio Siragusa, broadcasting here from Los Angeles, and I am joined today by my co-host, Carlos Ponce in Mexico City and Kim Lantis in Hermosillo, Mexico. And we have our guest, Jesse Fewell, just outside of Washington, D.C. today, joining us. And he's going to talk to us about something really interesting, untapped agility. Specifically, we're going to talk about 7 leadership moves to transform your transformation. We're going to get to that in just a little bit, but before we do, Jesse, please introduce yourself to the audience. Let us know who you are and a little bit about your background.
Sure. Tulio, Kim, Carlos, I'm super excited to be a part of the show. I serve as a coach to senior leaders in Global 1000 organizations trying to transform their organizations to use these modern practices like Agile or Scrum or DevOps. And if you're on a digital transformation or a culture transformation, there's a lot of confusing information out there, contradicting information. And I'm very passionate about helping people find the journey that fits them. Run a small private practice under my own name at jessefewell.com. And just loved collaborating and talking about this stuff because it is hard to do. So that's kind of the quick version.
Yeah, that's cool. So how did you get started on this path? We can certainly talk about some of those discrepancies too. I find it fascinating all the time how people call themselves an agile, and instead of doing stand-ups, they actually do these sort of like check-ins or status updates, which is not how it's supposed to design. But anyway, before we go into that, tell us a bit how you chose to go down this path for your career.
So I started off the first 10 years as a software engineer and started learning about some of these unconventional practices that were emerging in the software industry around extreme programming, pair programming, and more automation for things that are traditionally done by specialists. And then I'll never forget it. I was working as a software engineer on a contract for the United States military. And I came out of one of those releases as the only person on the program with 0 defects. I was using these techniques. I learned them pretty well. And we still failed miserably. And so that was my aha moment, that I could be the greatest engineer in the world, and our projects, our initiatives, our products will fail because of leadership issues. And that's when I moved into the project management track, because I believed that once I am a project manager and I get a certification and a title, then people will listen to me and we will not have those mistakes anymore. And so I did. And of course, you know what happens. Nobody listens to you. That's not the solution. So that's how I fell into management and leadership, is because I was convinced that the technology side of things is the entry fee into the game. That's the entry fee. Whatever kind of technological talent or skill or differentiator you have, what sets organizations apart are the messier, fuzzier topics of leadership. And I've been working on that, particularly within the transformation, agile, lean ventures for the better part of the last 10 to 15 years.
Great. This should be very interesting, considering most of the audience are all in the tech space. Kim, please introduce the show today.
Yeah, so you just mentioned it yourself, this idea of leadership. The tagline that you chose today specifically, Jesse, is 7 leadership moves to transform your transformation. Mm-hmm. So it's my assumption that we'll probably be going through each one of those 7 moves. But before we do, I would like to tap on, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, but what do you specifically mean with your play on words there of transformation?
It's intended to give leaders some credit. A lot of us in this transformation business, whether you're trying to find a really good partner to help you on the journey, or whether you're trying to wing it yourself, you oftentimes inherit a mess. And sometimes the mess has been a legacy mess for years. And sometimes it's just kind of like the beginnings of this bad turnaround effort or this really failed transformation effort. And you don't know where to begin. And many times that first failed effort was actually my fault. And and we get really judgmental of each other as leaders. We get judgmental, that consultant is giving bad advice, or that executive really needed to go. It's a good thing I am taking over his administration. And really, at the end of the day, it turns out that every move we make makes sense in some context. However, there's always a limit to any strategy, any direction, any best practice. There's a limit to it. And the next level forward requires you leaning against that first technique, that first practice, that first move. And that's the way forward. So there's 3 basic patterns. First, the boost. The boost is that best practice, that leadership technique, like installing best practices. Let's do some Scrum. Let's do some Kanban, or let's do some DevOps. But eventually you're going to run into a fact where those best practices hit a barrier. You've got the boost. We've raised some capability, some competency. And now with the barrier, we're finding people are doing it wrong. People don't understand. It's adopted only sporadically, and it's very frustrating. And it's easy to blame whoever that change leader was that introduced the best practices for choosing the wrong ones, for finding the wrong partner, the wrong vendor. But really, the path forward is simply to lean against that barrier and find a rebound. And in the case of best practices, the rebound is throw the textbook away and tailor the techniques to your context. And unfortunately, we get so wrapped up in whatever Gartner says, or so wrapped up in what Forrester has to offer, we lose sight of the fact that our organization is our organization. And now we have the messy, confusing, intimidating task of having to adjust these best practices in a way that fits our environment, particularly the global context. There's not a lot of agile techniques that help us understand how to deal with 24 time zones. So those are the key patterns: the boost, the barrier, and the rebound. That's what we mean by transforming the transformation to get the untapped agility.
I like it. I guess, look, to the point is, everybody uses best practices, but there were best practices for the last organization or group of organizations that was practiced in. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to serve what you need. So let's talk about these 7 leadership principles. Can you walk us through it? And there's a reframe how we think about doing things. This is what I'm hearing is reframe how you're doing things, stop, and if necessary, change those things that are supposed to be best practices, be smarter. Please walk us through these 7 steps or principles that companies need to adopt.
Sure. There are 7 patterns that I've listed in the upcoming book, Untapped Agility. The book is releasing worldwide in August, in North America and other kind of distribution channels. So if we don't get to all of them, or if we don't get to enough depth for your audience to then want more, then they can go to the website and look for more details. But another example is buy-in. Why can't I get enough support from my staff or my leadership team on this journey, on this transformation? It feels like they're just going through the motions, or they're actively resisting me. And you take a step back and you look at that pattern. The boost was that you leveraged your role. You leveraged your positional authority to generate some momentum, some move forward, and you've generated some positive sights, some good signs that we're moving on the right direction in your department, in your business unit. And you're sensing that, there's only so much momentum until the rebound, you give it away. And a lot of times as leaders, we feel that our legacy hinges on being the one that drives the change forward. And every successful story we've seen about organizational turnaround or rebooting is about creating that guiding coalition. It's about creating a group, a cross-departmental, cross-organizational committee that has a broader set of relationships. And so it means giving it away in a sense where you lose a little bit of control of the transformation so that it can go viral, so that it can sustain. And that kind of leans against that original positive move to generate buy-in simply by saying, listen, I'm the chief operating officer. We're doing this. And that's a good way to get started, but it's not a good way to get buy-in. So that's just one example. And then there are several others around scaling the impact, finding more momentum instead of always being behind. And then the being philosophically consistent and then pragmatically ineffective. And then also looking at your own leadership effectiveness as the bottleneck for a transformation. And then finally, reframing the narrative, owning the change narrative instead of having the environment pigeonhole you, and pigeonhole and negatively critique and negatively frame the transformation. So those are just that's a sampling. That I've covered all 7 of them kind of very quickly. But that's the smorgasbord, the menu on the table in the book.
I like it. So I think I missed 2 of them. This is what I captured so far, and I was taking notes for our recap show, actually.
And there's going to be a quiz at the end.
So number 1, get buy-in, and this whole concept of enrolling instead of pushing down, up from the top down. Give it away. Scale for impact. I think I missed the next 2. But I got being pragmatic, reframing the narrative.
The first one, stop selling, start aligning. So you can get buy-in. Number 2, give it away to scale the impact. Number 3, throw the textbook away to find the right practices. The next one is master no in order to achieve the organizational focus of saying no to this initiative and no to transforming that department so that you can get momentum. And then attack culture and structure together instead of being a philosophically purist about first, let's do a reorg and let's change our policies. And we're philosophically consistent and everyone's complaining because that's fundamentally against our culture. And likewise, agility is about being different, not merely doing things different. Okay, that's a lot of noise. What are we going to do? So we have to attack culture and structure together to rebound into more momentum. And then the next one, number 6, look in the mirror in order to overcome the barrier that the change just feels wrong. It's either going too slow or it's moving into the wrong departments. The wrong people are declaiming victory when it's mine. And those are callings to look in the mirror. And then finally, number 7 is all the momentum is running into a barrier of criticism, negativity, unfair resistance. And so the rebound there is to acknowledge all of that negativity and own the narrative. So number 7, own the narrative.
So I'm curious, Jesse, are all of these, is this like a chronological thing? Like you have to have one before you move on the other? Or do you attack all of these sort of simultaneously?
That's a good question. I love that question because a lot of advice that consultants or gurus or authors, it tends to feel very sequential. And the answer is no. These are things that you pick based on your pain. You pick your path based on the pain that you feel. And as leaders, there's enough pain for us to feel where our energies are most needed. And that goes to step number 4, which is master the art of saying no. You can't transform everything at once. You just can't. Not only is there a limit to my own personal capacity, but there's a limit to the change threshold and the change tolerance of an organization. So no, don't do them in order. Pick the ones that are most pressing.
Do you happen to have a particular story that comes to mind that you could tell us of one of these pain points and perhaps a success story, whether it be your own? I know you're bound by non-disclosure agreements and things with clients, but can you talk about something that's just...
So one organization I had the privilege of watching from the inside is a global a media company, and this media company was struggling because the previous CEO had ushered in an unprecedented era of creativity. He was hired by the ownership in order to branch out into new digital distribution channels, to new video content, an award-winning mobile app. And all it did was drive the staff insane, because with all of these different initiatives, people were feeling fragmented. They were being yanked back and forth on all these different things. There were so many ideas. None of them had been monetized. They weren't generating any real revenue at all from that award-winning mobile app. And so they finally had to let that CEO go. And the ownership did, and they brought in a big name consulting firm, which I worked with as a sub, and the transformation lead there, he said, I can't fix everything. I can't repeat the same mistake that the previous leadership made by trying to change everything all at once. So acknowledge the boost. That previous leader ushered in an unprecedented era of creativity, where they now had so many assets they didn't have before. And that's the next thing. When you inherit a mess, a transformation mess, identify the assets that have been put into place by the previous leader, or even by your first phase of transformation, if it's yourself. And so he had to start triaging. He had to start choosing, what am I going to attack first? And he said, I'm going to change the things that I can quickly, the easy things. And then the more difficult things, like culture and HR policies, which were a mess, it's going to take time. He had to find a new head of product, and that took time, because installing there were 3 previous attempts to finding a new senior product leader, and it didn't, before they found the right one. However, he did install some of those best practices, like 3-week sprints, like putting embedded QA on every team. And he also installed a couple of practices, like a formal requirements document, that were soundly rejected by the staff. And so he did a lot of experimentation, but what was most impressive was he said no to everything. And it cost him some of his staff who resigned, some of his middle management layer that had been around during the transformation that he was trying to continue. It wasn't fast enough for some people, and it required courage on his part to stay the course, even if it meant that some people weren't willing to go on the journey further with him. And fast forward a year later, there was that natural attrition, a couple of new hires, fixing a few things, more collaboration across silos, and the culture is very different than it was a year ago. And as a consultant, he was offered the CEO position, and was brought on formally in that role. So that's one of my favorite stories that's captured in the book, about acknowledging the assets that were created during the first wave of transformation, and then noticing that the barrier is that's holding us back from further momentum, and then the rebound of leaning against all of that diversified assets and focusing on a select portfolio of change. So that's one.
That sounds very similar to what happened with, I think it was Gordon Methuen, previous CEO of Continental Airline. He was a McKinsey consultant. That's kind of exactly what happened to him as well, I think, if I recall correctly. Dating myself a little bit here. So I want to ask, what role does egos play into all this, right? Sometimes you've got an environment where there's internal conflict because of competition. People are not as open with each other. They're looking over their shoulder. There are some egos that are involved. How do you work through that? Is that one of the principles where it's talked about ownership? How do you establish a broader ownership so it's not just one person in charge of everything? And there's too much risk of that. That's not how we operate, certainly as a company. But what role does ego play in how you work through some of these things in your experience?
That's an insightful question that I'm intrigued by, because it sounds like you're tapping into a thread that weaves across all of the patterns. Because where a leader might find himself, herself in a journey is, I believe we need to go in this direction. This is the strategy. But my peer has a different opinion, and the head of the unit has a different opinion. And why can't they get on my page And so there comes to a point where we have to ask ourselves, do you want perfect, beautiful agility or imperfect, functional agility? So, and that there's a couple of different parts in the book. So one of them is in give it away, give away the transformation. So there might be some egos that are just not going to change anytime soon. Throw them a bone, give them a seat at the table. Let them feel like they're being heard. There's a fundamental human need for us to be heard. It's one of the first principles of leadership where you do listening tours and town hall meetings. Your people want to be heard. Well, so do your peers. And so do your internal competitors who are fighting for that next position. And that means embracing the idea that imperfect, broad agility is better than perfect silo agility. And that's hard. It's just hard to let go because, particularly technologists, we've grown up in do it right. It needs to be mathematically correct and mathematically perfect. And, there's a compliance element that I've always done. And now you're telling me to mess it up on purpose at the hands of other people? And the answer is sure. If you want something to change.
Right. I think a lot of what I'm hearing, perhaps you're familiar with the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, and how he has that triangle built with the first dysfunction is this absence of trust. Then you have the fear of conflict coming up to the lack of commitment, which what you were talking about, this idea, I think, of being heard, right? That even if the team ultimately doesn't go the direction that I think is the best direction, at least they heard me. And now I can at least get on board and sort of commit, right. To this decision that's been made. But the foundation here and in his theory is that, of course, it's based in a pyramid where you can't really have one without first addressing the other. But and finally, this idea of, teams dysfunction with their avoidance of accountability and their inattention to results. And of course, the solutions that come in there. But I think one of the things that really stuck out to me with the story that you told was this idea of the leadership being willing to stay the course, regardless of resistance, even potentially their own cost, right? Knowing that the first CEO was let go and then coming into this tumultuous area. And like, if I'm not successful, I could be next on the chopping block, but really having, I think, this tenacity and just willingness also to not self-sacrifice, but to be vulnerable. Is that something that you address?
I think, I'm a big fan of Brene Brown and her work, in particular, the recent book, Dare to Lead, where she talks about how to be authentic without being weird. And I took my approach to that in the final recommendation of own the narrative. And I'll never forget it. I was hired to, on staff at a large bank in North America to help drive a digital transformation. And this was just a couple of years ago. And I felt like it was my job to lie about agility and what it is and why we're using it. And I had to reframe the narrative. I had to reframe, and I had to do it publicly and audibly as a consultant, right? As a consultant, I know what the best practices are and what the industry consensus is on these things. And so we hired a number of other Agile champions reporting to me. And they chased me into a conference room and they were yelling at me, say, Jesse, modern incremental delivery is not about planning 12 months for one delivery. That's fundamentally not what we're supposed to do. And so I had to kind of think about it and say, you know what? You're right. And I'm frustrated too that that's not what this organization is choosing to do. That said, we have some assets here, which is we have a working relationship with our retail partner, which is not seen before in this company. And we're getting all the departments in the technology organization together on individual teams. That's never happened before. And there's a thirst and a demand for these practices, which all of you are trained and certified to bring. So yes, it's annoying that we're not going to see as frequent of deployments and releases of the technology. And that's in violation of DevOps and digital and agile. Yes, but that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. yes, I'm frustrated about this, but I can be hopeful about that. And so that kind of acknowledging the frustrations and acknowledging the truth is about being vulnerable, but I'm not being weird about it. I'm not being saying, yeah, man, it sucks and they suck and it all sucks. I'm trying to be authentic, but then also pragmatic about moving forward. There's that one scene, if you guys remember, in Saving Private Ryan, where the troops are walking in the field, and then one of the kind of soldiers walks up to Tom Hanks and says, "Hey, boss, how come we never hear you complain? You know, we're always complaining about the bad orders or not enough resources. How come you never complain?" He said, "Oh, I do. I complain up. I don't. It's not my job to complain to you guys, and I push it upwards."
Right.
That's a way to be authentic with your staff and with your troops, to say, yes, this sucks, this is hard, and we're going to move forward. We're going to press forward with these assets. And then you get to go complain to your own leadership about, you set me up to fail. I can't believe it. So you can be authentic and also be pragmatic.
I have to say I don't miss any of that because of our culture here or how we operate. We don't have those issues. we just don't. I mean, you know, we don't have this top down, have to please someone, have to impress someone. So there's all that jockeying for position. It just goes away, and people just bring their true authentic self all the time. But that's a whole topic for another time. Carlos, I think you had a question coming up. We're coming up on time, but you have a few questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tulio. Just one little thing, Jesse. I understand that you help people thrive at work, right? And so you work with teams that are kind of frustrated. You know, they're not living up to their potential, and you work with them and you bring them up to the desired level. So my question is, I mean, you do all this, or you have been doing this for a long time under, let's say, normal circumstances, right? And I'm talking about a pre-pandemic situation. Now, teams are working differently. They're scattered all over the place. They're facing different challenges. So everything is different. So in that context, Jesse, what would you tell our audiences? You know, those who are struggling to bring their teams together or keep their spirits up. What would you tell them, you know, in this day and age, in this context, so that they can still pursue thriving at work?
Yeah. So the first principle that I've come to experience firsthand is that every adaptive leader has a limit to their adaptability. And this is something I've been confronting personally. Is when this pandemic first came out, I was sitting back from my high seat saying, look at you, transformation leader. Look at you, digital technologist. You're supposed to be flexible and adaptive, and you're losing your mind over this change. You should be more like me. I have a diversified portfolio and I have an adaptive mind and I can adapt. And then I found a couple weeks later, I started yelling at my staff for no good reason. And while I broke down in my kitchen one night, just crying, and I don't understand, where's this coming from? And so I realized that I had hit my own neurological limit of stress, and my body was reacting. And this is from somebody who lives in change and thrives in change. I've done several personality profiles and culture profiles, and the creativity stuff is where I love to be, but I'd still hit my own limit. So number one, recognize every leader has a limit. Number two, because every leader has a limit, everyone is being hit up against it right now. Have some empathy. And so not only is there a call to action for us to have empathy for each other and whatever the limit is, don't judge the other person for their limits. They're different than my limits, and my reactions are different than their reactions. But there's also more empathy being given these days. I was on a meeting yesterday where a colleague of mine was trying to present to her, do a presentation, and her 5-year-old boy just decided to come up right there, right in the middle of the presentation in front of 55 professionals on an internal webinar. And so what do you do? Well, she did her best. She got a few words in, hit mute, and then let her co-host take over. And the rest of us are just kind of smiling. That's kind of beautiful and good for her for doing the right thing. So there's more empathy being given from us who see people struggling, as well as a call to action for you and me to offer more empathy, because all of us have our limits.
Thank you.
True. Well, unless you guys have any additional questions, we're up on time. I wanted to just quickly wrap up with one last question, unless somebody else has another question.
No, go ahead, Fewell.
So just very quickly, Jesse, words of wisdom you'd like to share in terms of what's a good way to start to set the context about being open within the organization, being open to looking at things differently. I like the guide and the principles you have on how to move forward, but what's a good way to kind of begin to have the conversation about, we're going to do things a little bit differently, and I want everybody enrolled in that mindset versus just following the next best practice? What's a good way to do that? What are some tips for those listening that you would give them to do that?
The first thing that comes to my mind is just by having the conversation. And it starts with one-on-ones, where you go on a private listening tour. And on a private listening tour, you reach out to who are the key influencers, well, you just sit down and you ask, listen, I've been brought in to implement some changes here. What do you think is most needed and why? And I remember Jim Collins' book, How the Mighty Fall. And this was the successor to Good to Great. In Good to Great, he was talking about companies like Fannie Mae, companies like Circuit City that were the overperformers. And then you fast forward 5 years after publication and they're all dying and struggling. And so he quickly followed up with the sequel, How the Mighty Fall. And he starts talking about the difference in how leaders set about their turnaround efforts and the temptation to barrel forward too quickly. And I'll never forget, he described one or two case studies of leaders who were just asking, what should we change and why, asking the right influencers, and then just that socialization of what's going on. You're going to get data points as you start hearing from different people around it, the topics, and then you'll see some patterns, and then you socialize the patterns. Guys, here's what I'm hearing. What do you think? And then this might be now your inner leadership team. And you might even begin those town hall meetings where you're saying, I've met with some of you, and these are some of the patterns I'm hearing. Where do we go with that? So I think being open, just listening first and acting second is a good way to kind of build some momentum in a place where too much action has already occurred. In a place where too little action has occurred, there might be the opportunity to flip the script a little bit. So that's why I think context is king, and we need to be sensitive to the environment that we're in. But those are just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that with us. Always better to get a team involved. Certainly takes all the weight off your shoulder as a leader when you can get more people involved. Thanks for joining us today, Jesse. It's been a pleasure to have you. We'll have to reconnect with you sometime down the road. I'd like to hear some more stories and challenges you've come across as you do this, especially after you launch the book. And Carlos, I think the next thing we have coming up is on Monday. We have the recap show. We're going to recap 2 shows, today's show and yesterday's. And next Wednesday or Tuesday, who do we have as guests? Are you ready with that, or you got to look it up?
Yeah, the thing is that the only thing that I'm still waiting for confirmation. It's like we have a guest, but the guest is not confirmed. But if it is correct, we're going to have Dirk Schmidt from BizTech. BizTech is a virtual conference platform that is international and that focuses specifically on technology companies. And that is going to be happening on Tuesday at the same time, right here on Dojo Live. And also, On Wednesday, we're gonna be speaking with the CEO of Zenergy Works, Mr. Eric Van Cleef. So that's going to be, I don't have the topics yet. The guests haven't sent them over to me yet, but we're going to have those two guests on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, 1 p.m. Pacific, right here on Dojo Live, as usual.
Great. Thanks for joining us, everyone. See you next
Thank
time.
you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.
And thank you, Tulio. See you next time.